Hi, I'm Richard, and amongst other things, I get paid to teach people about wild food here in the UK. This is the first video in our series about wild food essentials, and I'm going to be talking about how to forage for edible wild plants and mushrooms, whilst also avoiding being poisoned. Okay, so this one does come up quite often on our foraging courses and when I talk to people about wild food, and particularly for beginners, but it is something that you still need to have in the back of your mind or even the front of your mind when you're doing this as somebody who's more experienced. And that's because there are plenty of species out there in the British countryside growing wild, or things in gardens or in towns that will, if you ingest them, or if you ingest the wrong part of them or in the wrong way, or don't prepare them in the correct way, they will cause you a small amount of harm or a medium amount of harm or a large amount of harm. And at this end of a large amount of harm, you have death. Even without moving too far from here, you can find things like this hemlock water dropwort, which is growing all the way over just there. You know, these things aren't that rare, so you do need to bear them in mind. So once people get to the point in their foraging wild food journey that they realise, oh, there are toxic things out there in the woods, in the fields, in the edges of the roads, or wherever it might be, it's quite common for there to be some amount of nerves to creep into there, for some people to start thinking, oh, well, actually I might accidentally kill myself or my family or my partner or my kids or someone in my restaurant. I really don't want to do that. So they start to become really nervous about picking anything. And that's something we hear quite a lot, again, on the courses, because people come along on a foraging course because they want to learn how to forage. They want to learn how to identify things. They want to defer some of that risk over to somebody they perceive as an expert so that they can show them how to do it. But the thing is, all of those people, and you listening, or you watching, or you whatever you're doing whilst consuming this content, you already navigate this world. This world you live in is full of things that some of them are useful, some of them are toxic or harmful, but you managed so far to stay alive. Think about the thousands of buildings that you may go into over the course of a month or a year or your life. Those buildings have food in them or useful things in them, in packages and containers, in bottles. They also have things like cleaning chemicals and toxic things and fuels and oils in them. You know that you can eat some things or use some things, and you know that you should avoid other things. Think about a supermarket. Think about all of the different things in packaging there. You know that it's okay for you to buy and consume the milk or the bottled water or the ketchup or the beer or something like that. But you know you should probably not be drinking the bleach or the drain cleaner or any one of the dozens, hundreds of things that you might find in the cleaning aisle. You know that it's okay to eat some things and not okay to eat others because they have labels, they have packaging, they have things that give you information on the outside that tell you what is inside it. That's exactly the same process you need to go through for foraging, for finding edible wild things. You need to go look at the outside, look at the packaging, and it will tell you what that thing is. That is the secret to not being poisoned, to not putting toxic things into your body that shouldn't be there, is reading the packaging, reading what's on the outside. When it comes to food safety, particularly food safety with wild ingredients, you really have got to have a robust system for choosing what is the right thing and what isn't. And a probably doesn't really cut it. You have to be able to identify every single thing that you put into your basket, into the pan, whatever it's going to be put into. You need to be able to identify every single item that goes in. And that really is the secret. It's just identifying every single thing. But getting to that identification process isn't always easy, or it's not always easy as a beginner. When it comes to where you find that information to identify that mushroom or that plant or that tree or whatever that thing is, the thing I always recommend to people, and the thing I always urge people to buy first, is a field identification guide like this one. So this is a wildflower identification guide, but there's one here on trees, there's mushroom one, there's a different mushroom one there. This is more of a botanist guide, but all of these are published and written in a way that allows you to identify a species using the characteristics that you can see, what you can see in front of you. This is a foraging guide. This is John Wright's Forager's Calendar, but there's a load of other ones here. This does have some information on identification of those species in there, but it's more concerned with the taste or the history of that species, or the history of our use of that species, or the recipes, or what time of year you're going to find it, or which parts of it are edible, which parts are best, that kind of information. This ID guide doesn't really care about any of that. So a printed ID guide is going to be your best first option. Part of the reason for that is that this has been published by a company. This has been published by a company that cares a little bit, at least, about their liability, about the information in there being as correct as they can verify it to be. Because if somebody makes an identification based on incorrect information in any one of these, then potentially they are going to be able to have some sort of pullback on that company. They could pass some of the liability for what happened to them onto that company because they trusted that company. So it's in the best interest of whoever's published these books to make the information in there as correct as it could possibly be. That doesn't always apply with online articles or social media content or stuff like that. There's loads of really good stuff out there, but there's also some really crap stuff out there as well. And if you're a beginner, it's hard for you to tell the difference between them because the same platform is publishing the good stuff and the crap stuff. There's good stuff on TikTok, there's crap stuff on TikTok, there's good stuff on Instagram, there's crap stuff on Instagram. You can't tell really as a beginner what platform, what person, what content is right for you or what is correct information. But at least in a boring printed guidebook like this, you've got some chance, at least, or a higher chance of that information being correct. There are some useful apps, there are some useful AI tools now, but they are useful sometimes. They are not reliable. So I've a good few apps on here. I use the AI search function, I use image recognition, I do image searches on Google. I use my phone a fair amount whilst we're doing this kind of work, but I also know that that information that is presented to me as a result of that search, as a result of me using the interface on that app, might not be correct. So apps and AI tools and things like that are good for finding wider context, or if you're 90% sure that this is the species that you've seen the other 5 times and you want to just quickly get a photo of it up on your phone, they're quite useful for that kind of thing. But for beginners, they're not so good. If you've got a good experience with an app as a nature ID guide previous to your interest in foraging, or you regularly use an app and you say, oh yeah, it's this species and it's this species, and it seems to be quite accurate, well, consider the higher risk of foraging compared to just nature identification. If you take a photo of something and say, oh, it's this species because the app told me it is, and you put that on Instagram or you tell other people, well, you might get embarrassed, somebody might point out that you're wrong, but that's about the worst that will happen. If you do that when it comes to identifying food and identifying a toxic versus an edible species, then the penalty for that failure is much higher. So apps are useful, but they go in a box. They go in a box of, it's useful, I'm not going to stake my life on it. Whereas a book like this, well, there may be errors in there, potentially, but it's gone through a lot more scrutiny than an app that's being redeveloped and has got user feedback from people who might not know what they're talking about and is there more to generate ad revenue. If you've got your guidebook and you're presenting yourself there and you're ready to go, how do you start? Well, each guidebook will have some information right at the beginning on how to use this guidebook. Often they have a bit of a workflow in there of, okay, you start here and then you go to this, and does it have these features, yes or no, or does it have one of these colors? And you go through a little flow, and then that takes you to a group of species that look similar or grow in a similar place or a similar habitat or so on. That's overall the process you should use for identification. You start off big and then you get down smaller and smaller in those details. So when I say start off big, start off with which country are you in, which continent are you on, And then which part of that country, how high above sea level, how far are you from the coast, what slope are you facing? Are you facing towards south, so you're facing towards the sun in the middle of the day, or are you on the north facing slope, so you get a lot of shade? Are you in a woodland like this one, or you're out on open grassland? Are you on a beach? Are you next to a river? Is it damp? Is it dry? All of those big factors will help you identify something, because you'll only find some species growing in certain kinds of soil, and those soils are created by the trees around them. The soil has to be a certain moisture level for that species to be there. So all of these factors will help you at least say, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, because the right conditions aren't there for it. Then think about time of year, because there aren't many flowers around in December, so if it's flowering in December, it's only going to be one of a few species. There aren't many fruits, there aren't many nuts or berries available in April, so if you're seeing those things in April, then it's probably only going to be one of a few species. So the time of year will matter for your identification, because some species will go from being one shape to being a completely different shape, size, colour, everything over the course of 6 months. So you really got to nail down that time of year as well for your identification, and a good ID guide will have all of that information listed out on the page. Next, look at the thing that you're trying to identify. Try and break it down into different sections maybe. So think about leaves being separate to flowers, being separate to the stem, and then once you've got those sort of bigger sections, you can start looking more closely at each part of that. So you can look at the shape of the leaf patterns, or are the leaves in pairs coming off the stem? Is there one at the end? Do they all come out at the same height, or in little terraces like this one? Or do they come all the way up and down the stem? What are the shape of the flowers? And does it have lots of little flowers on stalks like this hemlock? What's the stem like? Is it smooth? Is it hairy? Does it have spots on it? Does it have a certain scent? I mean, if you've got to the point where you're touching it and breaking it, you're probably already confident that it's not one of those species like giant hogweed, which is very harmful to touch, or a stinging nettle that you maybe don't want to be touching when you're still trying to work out what to do with things. So look at those bigger factors and get smaller and smaller and smaller. That's how most guidebooks work. They start off with really big things like what corner of the world are you in, and they finish down on details like there are tiny hairs on the stem in this period of its growth cycle. Exactly the same thing goes for mushrooms. For mushrooms, you look at things like what time of year, where is it, what's the soil type, what trees is it near, or is it not near any trees? Is it in grassland? Is it in salty conditions? So is it one of only a few coastal mushrooms? But do you get salty conditions next to a road as well? Because in the UK we put salt on the road in winter, so the bits at the edges of roads are saltier often than a coastal area. So think about the factors affecting where that little place is, where that little thing is growing, and why it's choosing to live there. And then with the mushroom again, look at the stem and the cap, and does it have a cap? Does it have a stem? Is it a stem and cap type mushroom? Is it a bracket? Is it something that looks more like mold and slime sitting on top of a log? Is it just a tiny little branch thing sticking up out of a log? And then what colour is it? How big is it? What scent does it have? Does it peel back on the top of the cap? Does it have gills? Does it have pores? All of those things will help you narrow down, okay, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. Learning how to use your ID guide is important, is vital for that guide, and they all work in slightly different ways. But you go through roughly the same process every single time. Big factors, getting down to small factors. Even down to, well, if you have things like this one, Francis Rose's Wildflower Key, there are things in here that say, well, if you see it under a hand lens, if you see it under a microscope, or if you see it under some kind of magnifying device, you can get right down to exactly the shape of the seed, exactly the shape of each petal on the flower, and that will help you with your identification. Same thing for mushrooms. There are some mushrooms you can only identify by looking at the spore pattern under a microscope. Once you get that identification, stop and immediately become suspicious. Immediately assume that there is a possibility that you might have got this wrong. So in these guidebooks, most things are grouped together with things that look similar or grow in a similar place or stuff like that. So go 1 or 2 pages that way and go 1 or 2 pages that way and see if there are things that look very, very similar. Because if you've done that step by step by step process wrong, or you've been a bit overconfident somewhere in there, you might have at some point branched off in the wrong direction and you should have gone left instead of right. So it is easy on that final stages, particularly with things that look very similar, but they grow in completely different locations, or they develop that feature at different times of year. It is possible, and actually it's quite easy when you're a beginner, to make this thing in front of you match what's on the page, because you go, yeah, it looks close enough, without realising, yeah, there are 5 things that look like that. You've got to get the right one. And if you can't get to the point of, yep, 100% stake my life, that is that, then leave it there. Or if you're at the point where you think it's safe to collect and you're safe to touch, then take a sample with you. Take lots of photos. Take photos of where you found it, the habitat it was in. Make notes around those kind of things. And then have another go at identifying it when you get home, because that's happened to me quite a few times. I've got something home and gone, oh, actually, yeah, it is this, because when I was stood in the field trying to look in the guidebook and see what it was or identify it, I was hungry, or I was talking to somebody, or I was distracted, or it was too hot or too cold, or whatever factor of human condition was affecting me that day. I just wasn't in the right frame of mind to identify it properly. But sat at home with a cup of tea, it was fine, it was easy. It was, oh yeah, it's quite obviously this one. It's got all the features, now I see it. If you do that, if you can't identify it in the field and you just take the photos home, or you just take one sample and then you get home and go, oh, it was that, well, you've not lost anything. In fact, what you've done is gained some knowledge. You've gained more experience in identifying things. You've gained some experience in where that thing grows and the kind of habitat it grows, and particularly you have a location for that thing that you can go back to. But it's better to maybe have missed out on one ingredient for one meal than it is to have died. There's a point where there's no reward that's worth a certain amount of risk. So if in doubt, just leave it there. There are accidental poisonings every single year, all around the world, in this country, in your country, everywhere. The thing is, only a small percentage of those are due to wild plants, wild mushrooms, and so on. Most of them are going to be from household chemicals or from other things that are man-made in some way. When you balance out the risk of getting it wrong versus the reward for getting that ingredient into your pan, onto your plate, into your whatever you're going to use it for, just think about that supermarket. Think about, okay, well, if you know what that label says, if you know what that packaging says, what the information on there means, then you can make a good choice about whether you're going to use it or not. When it comes to wild plants, when it comes to wild mushrooms, if you can't identify it, if you can't read the information on there to make that identification, to make that good choice, then you just have to leave it there. Because the information might be there, someone else might be able to read it. Next week, you might be able to read it. But it's better that you're still here to come back and have another go next week than it is to completely cock things up this time and poison yourself or poison someone else. And don't be disheartened, don't be discouraged if you have to keep checking the guidebook. If you're going, right, is that one? Yeah, it's that there. Right, I'll go and check the other guidebook now. Yeah, that has that, yeah. And I'll check the third guidebook, yeah. You aren't a lesser person because of that. In fact, you're actually a better forager. You're taking things more seriously. I would always rather be served a meal by the slightly nervous, over-checking forager than the really overconfident one that just goes, oh yeah, it was the wild mushroom that's growing in the field, so it must be a field mushroom. No. I'd always rather be fed by the person who's taking care and taking it seriously than the person who's being really overconfident and just not either not aware of those risks, or they're not balancing those risks against the reward in a sensible way. Relax and enjoy things, because it is okay to be cautious, and you are going to be coming across lots of content saying, oh yeah, there's just this one weird trick. If you only eat things growing on here, or if you never eat things that look like this, or only do this. But Some of those tricks work, some of them don't, but they often have a lot of exceptions that mean, yeah, this all works, apart from this one, which will kill you, which never gets into the TikTok video or the Instagram reel or YouTube short or wherever it is. The only tried and trusted method for always making sure that you put the right thing in your mouth is identification. It's boring, but it's what works. This is not something that we're still working out as humans. How do we identify the right things to eat? No, we've got the resources now. We've got ID books, we've got guides, we've got lots of reliable information out there. This is not something we have to experiment with. The information is there for identification of these things. Every now and again, some really obscure subspecies moves from this genus to that genus or from this family to that family, but doesn't really affect the identification in terms of toxicity. Do what ecologists do what botanists do what mycologists do what complete experts in their fields have to do when they go out, which is take a guidebook with you. Because this guidebook, well, this is the one that belongs to Amy, and she's had a whole career doing this. I've got friends who are ecologists. I do a little bit of ecology work where I have to go out with other people or go out to identify things as a business, and you have to go out and identify a plant and say, this is, yep, 100% this is that. I take the guidebook with me because you can't possibly remember every single thing that's out there. Taking the guidebook is fine. Checking against the guidebook is fine. If you're watching this and you're still a little bit nervous, that's fine. Confidence doesn't come from just getting it right the first time. Confidence comes from working out where your strengths and weaknesses lie and then make positive steps towards improving those weaknesses and getting you towards where you want to be. It comes from making lots of little low consequence mistakes again and again, but within a balanced understanding of what that risk overall is. You're making forward steps, but you are aware that, yeah, if this goes wrong, and if I do it wrong in the wrong way, it's going to have serious consequences. So you become more confident by just doing little bits again and again and again and again, and moving forward constantly. You don't become confident, you don't become good at things by just flailing around and doing it once until you hit the right result and then saying, right, we're done. And it really is that simple. You use a guidebook, you identify every single thing, and you don't put it into your body, or you don't put it onto your skin, or you don't put it into someone else's body if you don't know what it is. Or as the cool kids keep telling me on Instagram and blogs and everything else, never munch on a hunch. Thank you for watching and for getting all the way to the end of the video. If you want to hear more about what we do, then we've got a podcast. It's on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Podcast Addict and everywhere else that would have us. So there's a link for that below the video, and it's on our website. And also on our website, you'll find all of our courses, some articles, some species guides. We're adding more to that as we get time because we spend a lot of time out working with clients. We also work with businesses that use wild ingredients in their products, and we teach organizations how to teach other people about wild food, and we train instructors. So we do a lot of stuff around wild food. A lot of it is on the Wild Food People website, but if you want to know more, then just contact us. All of our contact information is on there as well. If you think we can help you with a project, then get in touch there. And if you want to support this channel and the bits of the content that we do and pay for some of the equipment that's filming this, then we've got a Patreon account as well, and you can go there and you get some extra behind the scenes stuff and some other things. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you again next time.